First on BBC One.
Hello and welcome to the History CV of Britain. This is episode 23. This evening I'm joined by Dr Stephen Pigeon for our final instalment on early Christianity in Britain. But first, a few things to get through. So now last week you may remember that I brought up the Luvians. A friend of mine contacted me to tell me that in her book, the Times History Atlas, which is a study of the genealogies of tribes over thousands of years, the Luvians are in there, and they're sometimes referred to as the Celts. So I had a look into this, and I had a look into the tribe of Lud. Now, I couldn't find too much about that, unfortunately, but what I did find was this. So according to the Table of Nations in Genesis, Lud was a son of Shem and grandson of Noah. The descendants of Lud, following Josephus Flavius, are connected with various Anatolian peoples, particularly Lydia. Lydia was an Iron Age kingdom in Western Anatolia, which is now modern-day Turkey. So the descendants of Lud are connected with various Anatolian peoples, including Lydia, and their predecessors, the Luvians. So I found that very, very interesting. And of course, we now know that the Luvians are sometimes described as Celts. So there are some interesting alignments there. So let me know what you think. Okay, that's to start with. Now, I'm still reading this. Did I remember to reverse image? I did. Well done, Paul. Okay, so I'm still on the Celt, the Druid, and Chaldee, written by Isabel Hill Elder. At some point, I think it was in the early 20th century, this was written. And I've come across a passage in that book that concerns Hugh Goddarn. Now, Hugh Goddarn is a character that I find very, very interesting, possibly linked to Princess Albine and the Albine migration to Britain around 1500 BC. So I'm going to read you that passage. So bear with me a moment while I just try to share screen with you here. I think it's that one. Let's see if I've got this right. Okay, I think so. I'm going to blow that up a little bit so you can see it a bit more clearly. So I'm reading down from the second paragraph. So the educational system adopted by the Druids is traced to about 1800 BC, when Hugh Goddarn, his Sicyon, I think that is, or Isaacson, or Hugh the Mighty, led the first colony of Cymry into Britain from Deffrobain, where Constantinople now stands. In the justly celebrated Welsh triads, Hugh Goddarn is said to have mnemonically systematized the wisdom of the ancients of these people, whom he led west from the Summerland. He was regarded as the personification of intellectual culture and is commemorated in Welsh archaeology for having made poetry the vehicle of memory and to have been the inventor of the triads. To him is attributed the founding of Stonehenge, and possibly Avebury, and the introduction of several arts, including glassmaking and writing in Ogham characters, on Huguedan's standard was depicted the ox. In this possibly may be discovered the origin of the sobriquet John Bull, who established, among other regulations, that a Gorsedd or Gorseth or assembly of druids and bards must be held on an open, uncovered grass space in a conspicuous place in full view and hearing of all the people. And that reminded me, of course, of Joseph of Arimathea and other disciples coming to Britain and setting up the early church in Britain. And apparently singing was a very important part of their worship in open spaces. So there is another link there to Druidism. Okay, so we have Hugh arriving in Britain, 1800 BC. So the Albi migration, we think, was possibly around 300 years after that. We have the first influx of the Cymry into Britain. We have the creator now of the Druidic Welsh triads and the founder of Stonehenge. Well, that's an interesting one, because most people that I know, that I've spoken to, would place the founding of Stonehenge a considerable amount of time prior to 1800 BC. But I don't know, anything's possible. Let me just stop sharing the screen for a moment. Bear with, I think that's back. Okay, good. Right, okay. So let me know what you think. Now, I spoke to Adrian Gilbert this week via Messenger, and this is all to do with the rather frustrating conflation of the character Arviragus with Caractacus. So some people say that these two characters were brothers, some people say they were cousins, and some people are saying that they're the same person. So I thought I would ask Adrian Gilbert about this, and I'm going to share our brief conversation, if I can get this right. Hold on a minute. I think it might be that one. It is. Brilliant. Okay, so sharing onto screen now. So let me just blow that up a little bit so you might be able to see it, hopefully. Oh, there we go. So Adrian says, there are a couple of points I want to clear up, as there are some mistakes in the Holy Kingdom genealogies. When writing that book, I was new to the subject and so did not always see this. Firstly, Arviragus or Arviragus is not the same man as Guirig. The latter is called Guiderius by the Romans, and he was Arviragus's elder brother who died in battle in AD 43. Caractacus, or Caradoc, to give him his British name, is also not the same as Arviragus. This is a mistake that crept in with the Roman historian Dio Cassius, who was active in the end of the 2nd century AD and earlier part of the 3rd century. A much better source is Tacitus. He was married to the daughter of Agricola, who was governor of Britain under Emperor Domitian. Tacitus tells us clearly about the career of Caractacus. He was king of the Silures tribe of South Wales and also over-king of many other tribes of the west of England and Wales. Guiderius and Arviragus were sons of Sinfelin or Cunobelinus, or Cymbeline, to give him his Shakespearean name, or Yellow Dog. Now, some of these names coming up, I'm not the best at pronouncing, so apologies for that. Sinfelin was a son of Tenufan or Tenovantius in Latin. Tenovantius and Adrogius or Avari were sons of King Lud. Avari would have been king of the Trinovantes and indeed much of Britain when his father died. However, he was judged too young, and so his uncle Caswallon, or Cassivelanus, or Cassivellaunus, I should say, was elected instead. This prompted Avari to make a pact with Julius Caesar in order to get Caswallon off the throne. His rebellion ultimately failed, and so when Caesar withdrew in late 54 BC, Avari, the traitor, went with him. Instead, Tenuefan was put on the throne, and that line continued. Last bit coming up. Okay, so that name at the top, and she was known as Cartis Mandua, is believed to have been a daughter of Avawi, although granddaughter seems more likely to me. She would have grown up in Rome. She married King Venutius of the Brigantes tribe of northern England. She it was who betrayed Caractacus to the Romans in the days of Claudius. She was later divorced by Venutius, who rose in rebellion against the Romans while Agricola was governor. Agricola smashed this rebellion and brought northern England firmly into the Roman Empire. He then went on into Scotland, defeating the Picts in a great battle somewhere in Caithness. However, he was recalled to Rome by Domitian, who was jealous of his popularity. Thus, Scotland, or at least the more northerly parts of it, remained outside of the Roman Empire. So Adrian hopes that clears up the confusion. He also goes on to say there that it's fairly pointless relying on Tudor or Stuart historians for this period. You're much better off going to the early Welsh sources or the Romans for more accurate information. All right, I've got about 100 tabs open here. Bear with me a minute while I make sure. That's it. I should be coming back any moment. There we go. Brilliant. Okay, so do let me know what your thoughts are on this so far. Let's see if we've got anyone in the chat box yet. Blimey, loads. Brilliant. Okay, great to see you, Andrew. Thanks for joining me again. David J is with us. Epic Eons, one of our regulars. Good to see you, Epic. Meg, lovely to see you, Meg. Susie Logan is with us as well. The incomparable Marshall Abrahams. Good evening, Marshall. There's a new name. Ludgate Hill, exactly right. Yes, that's correct. Oh, that's handy. We've got Hugh Godan in the chat box. Well, that does make things a little bit more simpler to decipher, hopefully, Hugh. So if you could fill me in on what you were up to about 3,500 years ago, that would be fantastic. Susie Logan. He could have done an alteration as Stonehenge had many phases. Very good point. That was my first thought on that, because from what I understand, which is not a great deal, but it would seem to me that Stonehenge goes way beyond, or the early stages go way beyond 1800 BC, possibly 7,000 or 8,000 years before Christ. But that's a very good point. Another new name here, Cameron. Hello, Cameron. Joshua in the Bible renewed the covenant by laying a stone by an old oak tree. That is correct. And that's something that this evening's guest mentioned on a previous podcast. I'll just cut to Marshall. Marshall has said the difficulty with this is that Hugh Godan is associated with the introduction of farming, which seems to be 2,500 years before Albine, so about 6,000 years ago. Well, isn't that very, very interesting? Okay, so the last time I had Marshall on, we were discussing Hugh Godan, and I'd previously read somewhere, and I couldn't remember where, that Hugh Godan is synonymous with vegetation. And some people would say that at least one of the reasons why Silbury Hill was built was to increase farming yields. So I'm finding all these interesting coincidences, I suppose. It's great to see so many people in the chat box and having a nice chat with each other. Brilliant. Okay. Right, Paul, is there anything else? Yeah, just one thing to mention before I bring on this evening's guest. Another video from Orgulug. My mate's at it again. This time it's a really good video on the Breton migrations. So in this, Orgulug covers the migrations of the Britons into Armorica, which is present-day Brittany, when the Saxons invaded Britain. And they took their language with them. And this, of course, reminded me of Alan Wilson's story of the Bretons in the middle part of the last century travelling from the north of France to Wales and being able to communicate with many of the Welsh people there because the languages are so different. So isn't that all extremely fascinating? Isn't history great? Okay, I'm going to bring on our guest for this evening. So Dr. Stephen Pigeon has been with us on 2 previous occasions. His information is vast and impressive, and they're 2 of my previous episodes, 2 of my favourite previous episodes on the History CV. So without further ado, enough waffle from me. Let's bring on Dr. Stephen Pigeon.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Hey, I'm very good. Very good. I'm very good. I'm very glad to be with you again.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, it's great to have you on with us. I really appreciate it. So I've sent you some of my questions, but if you don't mind, I'll ask you this first. In previous episodes on the CV, there's been much talk about the term Celtic or Celts, and there seems to be some conjecture as to whether or not this term came into Britain around the beginning of the 18th century, or if it ever actually applied to the ancient Britain. So would you mind giving us your take on that?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. This is really a very fascinating subject because, when you look at the word Celtic, and I think your evidence has shown this, the first time it appears is sometime late in the 1500s. Now, one has to keep in mind that the English language really didn't settle until about the 1520s, 1530s. It was with Miles Coverdale's work in the Great Bible that took it from Tyndale. If you go back and read Tyndale, you'll see that he never spelled the same word the same way twice. And so you had very much the language was very much like English society at that time, which is who knows what it was, right? Fairly disjointed,
Mm-hmm.
and a blending of Saxon and French, and also the Welsh, and also the Picts and the Scots and the Celts, and on and on and on. And the Danes all had influences on the language. So what word was going to be correct where? And finally, Miles Coverdale refines the language and says, we're going to spell everything the same way. And so the Great Bible of 1539 begins to concretize the English language. There is a group
Okay.
in the English Bible that were called the Chaldeans. So you see them Chaldeans, the Chaldeans. Now, the Hebrew word for them
Yes.
is Kasdim, Kasdim. And this group is a very interesting group because they were, if you want, a group primarily out of Anatolia. And this group
Mm-hmm.
is responsible for building Nineveh, and they're also responsible for building the beautiful city of Babylon. In fact, Babylon is called the
Wow.
excellency of the Kasdim. However, in the early English Bibles, it was called the excellency of the Chaldeans, but the Chaldeans is a mispronunciation because the CH is pronounced with a K, Chaldeans, Chaldeans. Now, there was a mass
Mm-hmm.
migration of this group around the 3rd century, 4th century AD, following this huge battle between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire, kind of like the battle that's going on right now, in really the same area and over the same turf. But you saw millions of men die on both sides of this battle. And the Parthians then are going to vanish as an empire. And it is going to be given over to the hands of the Persians as the Parthians begin to move north. And part of the reason they moved north is because we were in an inordinate period of global warming. It's very, very warm during that period.
Yeah.
And so, because of this, Europe, which had been very, very cold prior to that, was suddenly looking very attractive. The ice was gone out of most of the rivers, the glaciers had melted, and the valleys were looking very keen for commerce and a place that could be readily populated, particularly in the Germanic forests, which, by the way, would allow the Parthians to flank the Romans, which is what they did. They flanked the Romans. Now, that that migration of the Chaldeans, this was a people group that also occupied the Hittite Empire. If you go back and you look
Wow.
at Hattusa and the Hittites, this was a multicultural society in Hattusa, and these Hittites and these Chaldeans would begin to move north. Now, the Chaldeans, as a source, is very interesting because they're primarily built on the brother of Abraham. So in the scripture talks about Abraham, he had no children for many, many years. But his brother had 12 sons. His brother Nahor had 12 sons. And it was from this group of people that the Chaldeans would form. So the Chaldeans then they migrated primarily into Central Europe. So you're talking Austria, Czechia, Slovakia, Germany, Poland, maybe into this area, that area, Hungary. They migrated into that area and they became known as the Chaldees. But the Chaldees became known as the Chaldees. The Chaldees became known as the Celtes, which eventually became the Celtic people. This word Celtic isn't going to be used until the English Bible is translated, and they're looking at the Chaldeans. And so from the Chaldeans, we get the word Celtic. Now, the Chaldees are an interesting group too, because they are going to come out of the same source. They're going to come out of the Central European source. And they would come into Britain as kind of an antithesis, if you will, to what the Druids were doing. So that there was a push back. You had this emphasis of the Druids coming out of Wales, Ireland, Scotland. And then you're going to see this kind of pushing back by the Chaldees saying, well, wait a minute, this has to be adjusted, that has to be adjusted. And so there was very much a, I don't know, an argument, I guess, a debate going on over some of these things. But when you look at the Celtic people, there's amazing things about it. I mean, we're going to talk about some amazing stuff today, Paul. I'm telling you, we're going to talk about some amazing. But when you look at the idea of the Celtic people coming out of Central Europe, this was one of many migrations. You have to remember that there was a migration that took place from the house of Yasharel that was all migratory into Europe. And so it wasn't just the Celtic people that were in Central Europe. There were also the Goths, right, which comes from the tribe of Gad, Gad, one of the 12 tribes of Yasharel, and they would become Gad, and then they would become Goth, and Goth in German, Goth, would become pronounced Goth in English, and they would center in Austria primarily as Ostrogoths. This would become Austrians, the Ostrogoths. And the Western Goths, the Visigoths, would move across Switzerland, across France, across Spain, all the way into Morocco. And so this migration of this tribe was also something very important. And so when you look at the idea of the Celtic people in Britain, who are the Celtic people in Britain? Now, you mentioned the tribe of Lud, and the tribe of Lud being in Lydia in Anatolia. What's interesting is that you see there's a character in Scripture that is not talked about because he's the scapegoat. And this is the firstborn son of Judah. So Judah, the whole story of Judah is like, Judah was not a nice guy, okay? He wanted to kill his brother, and he took a Canaanite woman to be his wife, and she had 3 sons, and they didn't want to marry this woman that he brought home for them to marry. And so eventually she plays the prostitute. He picks her up. She gets pregnant with twins. He finds out she's pregnant. It's like, you need to burn. And she says, well, before you burn me, here's the cloak, the staff, and the ring of the guy who got me pregnant. And it was him. But the scripture says something interesting. It says he never touched her again. And we're going to get into this story from this point later on. But she gives birth to 2 sons, Zerach and Perez. Zerach is the firstborn. He's the primogenitor. So by the Torah law, he has all of the rights of the primogenitor. Now, again, a lot of people don't want to hear this, but we're going to be dealing with some very interesting stuff. Now, one thing I wanted, before we get into this other stuff, you mentioned Hugh Gadron, right? Okay. Now, the word Hugh in Hebrew means he. And if you look at this Gadron, this is an antonym, if you will, for garden. He who gardens.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Wow. Yep.
Who gardened 6,000 years ago? Who gardened? Cain. Cain gardened. But you recall Abel, who was a shepherd who had sacrificed an animal, Cain kills him, and then Cain is expelled. Well, expelled to where? Where did he go? And when he went there, did he garden? Yes, he did garden. And he had 7 generations that were born after him before, antediluvian time. So somebody mentioned that Stonehenge may have an antediluvian creation, and it may have an antediluvian creation because, of course, Stonehenge is capable of predicting the orbit of all 10 planets within 3 decimal points of the elliptical mean, right? Really quite an incredible expression, even though Stonehenge has been moved from its original site. Nonetheless, the integrity of the edifice shows this algorithm. And the algorithm is expressed in stone to have a long-lasting statement about this understanding of the cosmology at that time. So it very well could be antediluvian. And these things were taught antediluvian. There was a huge cosmology. In fact, if you go back and look, all the megalithic record that is antediluvian, that we know is antediluvian, whether you're talking about the megaliths on Malta, or whether you're talking about some of the artifacts in Peru, such as Machu Picchu, some of the things in Indonesia, there are these megaliths that are antediluvian, or Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia. These megaliths are all marked with cosmological markings. Because they're marked with celestial marks, you can time stamp the given megalith. For instance, the 5 megaliths that are in Malta, those all pointed to the star Sirius, because Sirius was the North Star back in the ancient world, not Polaris. Sirius was. But they're all off. None of them actually see Sirius now. So when you go back and you line them up, when they did see Sirius, you can get the exact date as to when that temple was in use. So that's how they've been able to time date it. So the megalithic structures that are antediluvian were very concerned with cosmology and being able to date the structures cosmologically. Yeah. Okay, so Hugh Godwin, was that Cain?
Wow, really? So Hugh Godwin is Cain?
Very possible.
Okay.
Very possible. Hugh Godwin is Cain, the gardener. Wow. And that he had been expelled from the garden and came up to Britain.
Right. And so we're going back how many years? 6,000
years,
did you say?
If you're going to say 6,000 years, that puts you right at that time. Puts you right at the time of the expulsion from the garden.
Yeah. And I think that correlates with what Marcel said earlier, which is very, very, very interesting. Okay. So, and just going back to the Luvian tribe, my friend, Times History Atlas, I think it's called, she said that the Luvian tribe roughly migrated to 3 different areas. 1/3 went to the Mediterranean and became part of the Italians and Greeks. And another 1/3 went to Brittany, Wales and Cornwall. And the other 1/3 went to the Punjab in India and actually founded the Punjab. Is that something that you've come across before?
I have not heard of the Indian record, but the other record, yes. I was just in Sicily. And I can tell you, and this is part of our discussion today, that in Sicily they talk about the original people who populated the island of Sicilia were quote unquote Phoenicians. Well, the Phoenicians are an interesting group because the Phoenicians, who are the Phoenicians? They get this mystical, the Phoenician, here's the phonetic alphabet, and they were running around in ships and Phoenicians. Well, they were the northern tribes of Yasharel. This was Dan, Asher, Zebulun, and would have included the Semitic tribe of Lud. Now, here's why I was going with Zarak. Remember that Zarak, he's the scapegoat in the scripture, but the firstborn of Judah, the primogenitor. And only in Chronicles do we get a list of his sons. It's in First Chronicles, in chapter 2. It tells you that his sons were Calcol, Darda, Ethan, Haman, and Zimri. Well, Calcol is reputed to have formed Athens. Darda is reputed to have formed Troy. But when Darda formed Troy, he ruled over the Lydian people. So the Trojans were Lydians or Ludians. They were Ludians. And so this was the group that was in Troy. And Calcol, his brother, would form Athens. Now Ethan would go on to form Cadiz, Spain, and also Carthage, city of
Hmm.
Carthage. Haman ruled over a group of people they were called in the Irish literature, they're called furbolgs, bulgs or bulgs, but these are now called Bulgarians. They're also called Balkarians. They're also called Belgians, Belgique, and they were known in Ireland as the furbolgs. They were expelled from Ireland by the tribes, but they were furbolgs. But this is who this group is, and they were ruled over by a guy named Haman. Now this literature about Haman and the history of the Balkans and in that area is very obscure, very hard to get to because the societies have been so closed for so long. But there is a lot that is being unearthed now in the former Yugoslavia that is really very, very informative in terms of ancient biblical literature.
Wow.
So at any rate, with the tribes of Zerak, so now you see that Darda is going to build Troy. Troy is going to be full of Lydian people, and these Lydian people are the house of Lud. One of their migrations is into Britain, where they would begin to form a city called Ludonium that would become London, and its central place was Mount Lud, which is where the Cathedral of St. Paul is, who preached on Mount Lud,
Mm.
according to the 29th chapter of the book of Acts. So the Lydian tie is very, very close to these being this group. Now, would they have been called Celtic? Now, when we look at the Phoenician migration, now look at this, because you asked about Brutus, right? You asked about Brutus. Now we
Hmm.
got to talk about this because the Etruscan people, there's three alphabets that are common to one another. One is the Hittite alphabet, the other is the Etruscan alphabet, and the third is Colbran.
Hmm.
And these three are essentially the same alphabet. They're the same alphabet.
Yeah.
And they have as their root Paleo-Ivrit, Paleo-Hebrew, which is 22 foundation letters that are found in all three of those alphabets. There's many more letters in all three of those alphabets, but those 22 foundation letters are found in those alphabets. So when we talk about this is the Phoenician alphabet, which, by the way, that the Paleo-Ivrit, the Paleo-Hebrew, would transfer directly into the Greek and without benefit of the Aramaic block script or the Babylonian script that comes into the Hebrew after the Babylonian captivity. So, for instance, when you look at the Aleph in Paleo Hebrew, it's like an A on its side. Same thing with the bait. It's a B on its side. The Dalet is a delta in Greek. So these letters would transfer over to the Greek Cyrillic, which is now, by the way, the Russian Cyrillic, but this Cyrillic alphabet would be
Mm.
derived from the Phoenician directly. It's a modification from that. But the Etruscans, very important to recognize, the Etruscans were quote unquote Phoenicians, as were the initial Sicilians, Phoenicians. When you look at the island of Sardinia, Sardinia is actually, its original name was Sardania, the prince of the house of Dan, the place of the prince of the house of Dan. And the house of Dan, of course, was populated in Ireland and Scotland.
To
And
Arthur Danan. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And,
Yep.
and of course, Denmark and in Norway. And the reason why they were not populated on the western shore of Britain or in Belgium or in Holland is because that was a landmass. That was Doggerland. That was
Yep.
an agricultural. So when Cain came into Britain, he came into Britain on a landmass. He didn't, there was no boat.
Yeah.
It was just a migration. You think about the impetus of Hugh Gadran to say, okay, I've been kicked out of Eden. I got to get far away from wherever the people are to get to some place where I can stay safe. Now, all of this is not given to, none of this literature is given to us in the scripture because we get summary. When he got kicked
Mm.
out, then he went out and he had kids, and they went on for
Mm.
7 generations, right?
Mm.
But we do see that those generations are carefully tracked in scripture, right on up to Lamech and even to Naamah, who was likely the wife of Noah, Naamah, who was the sister of Lamech, the last of the line of Cain, before that line was extinguished.
Mhm.
So at any rate, so when we look at all of this together, when you put all this together, you can see the Etruscans had this history of Phoenicia, House of Dan, House of Zebulun, House of Asher, House of Ephraim, uh, probably Issachar was also in there. Lud was probably in that same group because they brought forward the same alphabet. You see evidence in the alphabet. The Aleph
Mm.
Beit is the best evidence to say this group is tied to that group, which is tied to that group. And so when you see this, this was the Phoenician foundation, then later replaced by the Greeks. But the Etruscans are going to be the ones who are going to essentially impose the republic, to depose the monarchy in Rome and to impose the republic around 500 BC.
Okay.
But my question to you is, go ahead.
I just need to bear with me 1 second. I may have a technical issue that I need to deal with. While I deal with that, can I ask you just to move on slightly from the Etruscans? Have you come across the work of the Covenant and how it connects to the migration of Brutus from Etruria? Can you tell us anything about the history and potential resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, Stephen?
Yeah, well, the Ark of the Covenant is always a mystery. Eh? It's a mystery. But, and of course, there are claims being made all over the world about where the Ark of the Covenant is. Now, when you talk about let me go into this while you're looking at that, Paul. When we talk about the history of the Ark of the Covenant, the key that you have to remember is in the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah tells us that when the destruction came into Jerusalem, that Nebuchadnezzar took away all the artifacts of the temple. But nowhere is it described that he took the Ark of the Covenant. So the story is that the Ark of the Covenant, and this is particularly told in the book of Second Maccabees, it's told that the Ark of the Covenant is buried in a mountain and that it was nondescript. In other words, there was no marking where it was buried. Now, the literature is very interesting when you talk about this because Jeremiah, you might call it mythology if you want, but in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10, it says Jeremiah would have the authority to look over the destruction and the bringing down and the tearing down of Jerusalem and its rebuilding. So Jeremiah did in fact do this. And the record, I think the best petroglyph record around is the tomb of Jeremiah in Ireland, which has a cosmological dating in the petroglyph that's inscribed on the wall inside the door, which gives a particular date. And the date has been reconciled by looking at the cosmology to pick out the year 581 BC. So because of this, the information that has been amassed by our friend Charles A. Go ahead. Okay, well, hopefully you'll be back, Paul. In the meantime, I'll keep going. But Charles A. L. Totten is the one who proposed and did in fact say that Jeremiah entered into Ireland with the Ark of the Covenant. And he also entered into Ireland with the Ark of the Covenant. He also entered in with the Torah scroll. He also brought in David's harp. He also brought in the stone of Screen. So these accompanied Jeremiah, and that they would replant Jerusalem at Tara. There's a reason why it's called Tara, because it's named after the Torah. So Tara Hill was named after the Torah, and according to A.L. Totten, the Tuatha De Danann occupying Ireland at that time were serpent worshippers. But when Jeremiah brought in the Ark of the Covenant and set it down on the ground, it chased all the serpents out of Ireland. Not St. Patrick. Jeremiah chased the serpents out of Ireland. Well, it's a metaphor for the fact that the serpent worship that was being done by the Tuatha De Danann would be terminated and the Torah would come forward. Now, keep in mind, at this time, I believe Ireland was connected by land to Britain.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. It was probably connected on the northern coast from Northern Ireland to the islands of Scotland, to the southern islands of Scotland. This is
Okay.
where I believe this was connected. And remember that Britain was connected to the continent in Doggerland. And I had a great discussion with a Welsh historian, museum curator out in Anglesey, Ian Jones, and he was right on top of the Doggerland stuff. He knew what I was talking about because there's been thousands of artifacts pulled off the North Sea floor showing agriculture. So there was
Right.
something was quite different at that time. You remember there were grapevines found in Scotland, and when they dug up the area for the crown to put in the skyscrapers in London, they found saber-toothed tiger remains.
Yeah, I
So
think I've come across that information before. Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, yeah, fascinating stuff. So the climate was different, and I believe the landmass was connected. So when it talks about when it talks about in Second Maccabees that this was that the Ark of the Covenant was buried in a mountain. Now Ross Broadstock took me to the mountain that Alan Wilson had told him this is where it's buried. This is the burial mound right there, and
Yeah.
that's where the covenant is. And we've been out there several times. And the last time I went out there with Ross, they put up signs, no trespassing, and then at the bottom of the sign it said, "This means you, Ross Broadstock."
Brilliant.
Yeah, I love Ross. I miss but anyway, but Ross had shown me this place several times. It's very possible that that is where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's very possible because again, the narrative is such that the Ark was brought with Jeremiah, and Jeremiah brought it, and then the Ark was buried, and it was buried in a mountain. This is what it says in Second Maccabees. It was buried in a mountain. Now they say Mount Nebu was the mountain where it was buried, but Nebu is another word for snow-covered mountain.
Oh,
So it
okay.
doesn't necessarily mean a mountain called Nebu that somebody says, "Oh, gee, there's Mount Nebu right there." Yeah, no, it means it's like Lebanon, for instance. Lebanon means white mountains, and usually that means mountains covered with snow, right?
Hmm.
That's what it means. And so this is why you have to be careful with the Hebrew and trying to capitalize the first letter and make it into a proper noun. Well, that doesn't appear that way in the Hebrew, you know. So this Mount Nebu could very well be this mountain in Wales. It very well could be. And so, yeah, I'm familiar with that narrative. Now, there were people who thought that the Ark of the Covenant was buried at Tara Hill, and so in the
Hmm.
1920s, there were guys who came over there with excavators and they dug the daylights out of Tara Hill until finally the Irish went, "Okay, you didn't find anything. Now put everything back where you found it."
Yeah.
And so to this day, it's off limits now. You can't go up there and do any archaeological digs on Tara Hill. I mean, you already had your shot, didn't find it, it's done, it's finished. The
Yeah.
hill that Ross pointed out to me, one of the interesting aspects of the burial mound is that it has drainage.
Hmm.
Have you been out to these mounds at all, Paul? To see any
No,
drainage?
I haven't, but I saw a documentary about it recently, and I was going to mention to you, there's a stone that points to this hill. I think
Right.
it's called the Lion Stone or
The
the
limestone, yeah. Ross
yeah,
pointed that out to me too, yeah.
yeah.
I've
You
seen
see,
the limestone. It does point to that hill. And then when you
mm,
get to the hill, you can see the evidence of there are drainage. There's, I think, 4 points of drainage that are down maybe 100 feet from the top of the hill. And it's clear
mhm,
that it's clear that it's a mound, okay, because it's symmetrical. You know,
mhm,
when you take a shovel and you keep heaping dirt, you end up with a symmetrical mound. And so this mound is symmetrical, but I mean, it's big. It's big.
mm,
And of course, the last time we were there, they had it fenced off. There were sheep up there grazing. It's like, no, don't come here. Don't come on
mm,
this property.
mm,
The same thing with Jeremiah's tomb in Ireland. You see evidence of drainage from inside. There's like 4 drainage areas at the bottom, at the base of the mound. The difference with Jeremiah's tomb is that that's heaped rocks. The rocks are just heaped up, whereas the mound in Wales is dirt. It's not
mhm,
rocks, it's dirt.
mhm,
And so I think Alan Wilson, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Alan Wilson's research. I went to the Church of St. Peter's that Alan bought because the Welsh government was going to put a windmill there. He said, "Hey, you just can't tear down this church. This is where Arthur II was buried. There were 1,000 people that attended that funeral in that church."
Yeah.
And so I told Ross, I said, Ross, you got to take me there. We got to go there. And sure enough, there was a rocking stone, by the way, outside that church. There was a rocking stone. We stood on the rocking stone before we went to church, and the church only had 2 rooms. It's got the apse and it has the main sanctuary. But Alan Wilson said, look, if you're going to bury royalty, you bury him to the right-hand side of the altar looking out. So he dug a 20-foot trench on that side. And sure enough, they got down there and they found the grave. And when they opened up the grave, they found a skeleton holding a cross that said Arthur.
Mm. And I believe that church is dated to the 1st century AD, I think, which is incredible. Yeah. Amazing.
So that took place around, I think that was around 592 AD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that church is still accessible, by the way. You can get there. You can walk there.
The last I heard, I think, because I think Alan Wilson had that excavated around 1990, if I remember rightly. So we're going back now 35 years ago, and I think that there's it's become even more dilapidated since Wilson excavated it. More stones have been lost, and so that's very sad if that's the case. But fascinating. Sorry about earlier, by the way. My battery and our connection were very, very weak, and I went into a mild panic, but I've sorted it out now. Sorry about that. Saved the day at the last second. Okay, brilliant. So just to recap, because unfortunately, I know my viewers were listening to your every word. I missed the first part of your last response. So just for my benefit, you have Jeremiah bringing the ark with him to Ireland originally, or Britain, and you don't have Brutus doing that, no?
No, not Brutus. No, Brutus is an interesting character, and again, if I had a whiteboard, I'd show you this, but Brutus in the Hebrew, okay, is spelled Beit Resh Tav Shin.
Yep.
Beit Resh Tav Shin. So you could come in there and say, okay, great, let's put a U in between these consonants, BRTS, right? Brutus. However, the Sheen, depending on where you put the dot, becomes an SH and not an S. So Brutus, except that it might not be an O or U, it might be an I. British.
Yeah, exactly. They picked the wrong vowel.
and in the Ivrit, that means the covenant man.
Mm-hmm.
The covenant man.
Yeah.
So British, that they call Brutus, was actually a title, not a name.
Yeah.
A title, not a name. Now, my understanding is that the record shows Brutus showing up in the 1100s BC, not later, not around 500 or 600, but around 1100 BC.
Okay, Geoffrey of Monmouth has him 1100 BC, doesn't he? But I believe that Alan Wilson wrote the book The Trojan Wars, and he placed Brutus around 650 BC or 600 BC, I think. But you wouldn't agree with Alan Wilson on that?
That would make him the Brutus Etruscan. That would make him the Etruscan. Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, that's very possible. And part of the thing I'm wrestling with right now, Paul, is that the Kolbrin language and the Qumraic and the Qumri. Now, we talked about the Qumri before, about how they I believe they picked up that name because they were under the tutelage of Omri or Umri, a king in northern Israel. You're showing you showed evidence earlier that appeared that the Qumri had arrived in Wales much earlier. But my following on this would be that the Welsh did not arrive in the land until around in the 700s BC.
Okay, can I just interject there briefly? I should have the book with me. There's an author that I've interviewed on this podcast before called Marshall Abrahams, and she's written a book called The Great Migrations to Britain. And she covers 2 migrations. One is Brutus, and the other is Princess Albine, who came here from, I think it was Syria, to this country around 1500 BC. So, and she's written many pages on this. There are many names, town names, place names that allude to her migration here, and all sorts of other evidences. So if you get a chance, Dr. Pigeon, I would highly recommend this book to you. And
Yeah.
the author's been on it. She's probably in the chat box, and she's been on a couple of times on the podcast, and we've done interviews about it. So yeah, I would definitely look into the Albine migration to Britain. But it looks like, as you said now, Hugh Gadan was Cain, and that was around 6,000 years ago. So yeah, so it's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so we begin to see kind of this interesting combination. Now, I mean,
Yeah.
part of the reason why I think it was kind of a later move. Now, it could be that this was a dual migration, that we had this migration 1,500 years before. I mean, I saw some artifacts in Cornwall that were ancient. There's an ancient village there that is ancient. You know, goes back before any thatched house. And so it's possible that there was a people group there that were constituting these people. Because one of the things that is kind of a mystery is the work that Ross Broadstock and Alan Wilson did in translating the Egyptian hieroglyphics by using the Welsh language.
Yeah.
And by doing that, Alan Wilson was able to completely decipher the Black Obelisk at the British Museum, which, by the way, told the story of Joseph, which is absolutely amazing. That it would be so clear on that obelisk. But when you look, and then Ross, of course, printed the book Cumberglyphics with us, which is a dictionary as to how to do, how to understand Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the fact that the Welsh language is so tied to the ancient Egyptian, you might even call it a Canaanite language, And this is why I believe that the Qumraik are actually the children of Joseph, not by Ephraim and not by Manasseh, but by the other sons of Joseph. Now, the book of Jasher details this, that Joseph had other children. Only Ephraim and Manasseh are labeled in the Bible, in the text, in the scripture. But Joseph had other children with Asenath in Egypt. And these other children became a tribe that I believe sojourned with Moshe. Now, when you look at the sojourning with Moshe, this is in the year 1500 BC, approximately, right in that range.
Yeah.
So if it was a tribe that came out, if the Albine migration, what she's talking about, the Albine migration, there were several migrations that took place out of Egypt. And these migrations happened because Egypt detonated. If you read the Colburn has a very absolutely fascinating description of what happened at the time of Moshe. I don't know if you read it or not, but the Great Destroyer is in the heavens, and it was so catastrophic and so overwhelming to the Egyptian people that they wouldn't do anything. They just sat down and said, "There's no reason to be alive." So they were numbed, they were terrified, they did nothing, and it was Moshe who said, "Hey, look, we're going to do something. Even if you're not going to do something, we're going to do something. We're going to gather up and get out of here." Well, there were some other tribes that had left earlier. That the house of Zerach had all left Moshe earlier. They didn't stay for the Egyptian captivity. So when the house of Yasharel first came into Egypt, they were not in captivity. In fact, I would argue that their slavery, only lasted for 35 years.
Okay. Does the Queen Scotia migration out of Egypt figure in with all this?
The what migration?
The Queen Scotia.
Oh yeah, the Queen Scotia. Now, when you talk about this is a discussion that takes place with the migration of Tia Tefi and Scotia or Skoda, and that these were supposedly the daughters of Zedekiah. Now, this narrative, I think, is a true narrative. Zedekiah was a jerk. Yeah, I mean, it's just the easiest way to put it. He didn't listen to anybody when people were telling him, "You're doing it wrong. You should just pay your homage to Nebuchadnezzar, pay your tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, and live happily ever after." And he instead conspired with the king of Egypt to wage war on Nebuchadnezzar. And once Nebuchadnezzar moved troops into place, the Pharaoh from Egypt took one look at it and said, I'm not doing that. And so Zedekiah was on his own, as Jeremiah had told him would happen to him. And anyway, when Zedekiah fled Jerusalem, he fled with his 7 sons and left his wife and his daughters behind. He left them behind. Well, they all got caught anyway. They got caught and were all killed. But the daughters did not. And according to the narrative, the daughters did not get killed. They left with Jeremiah and Baruch. So in the Irish literature, they call Baruch Brug.
Brug, yeah.
Brug. And so Brug and Olam Fala, which means the wise man, the old wise man, arrived with Tia Tefi, whose real name was Tamar, but it was Tamar and Skoda. There's 2 stories on this, that Tamar and Skoda both arrived at the same time, coming into Ireland, and then Skoda would go to marry the Scottish king, and Tamar would marry Yoked the Herriman in Ireland. And so this is the narrative as I understand it. And the Stone of Scone would then move to Scotland and not remain in Ireland, but the harp would. And what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Jeremiah took it somewhere and buried it somewhere. Now, again, Charles A. L. Totten tells us that he arrived with the Ark of the Covenant and that he buried it in a mountain somewhere in Ireland. But what was Ireland at that time? When you're talking about when you're talking about the landmass being connected,
yeah.
See that when you realize the landmass is connected, it changes the whole everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, while we're talking about that, you asked me a question, and I kind of wanted to go to this question because this was about Monobaz II.
Yes.
Yeah, you asked me a question, and I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. And you asked me another question too about the Druidic prophecy about Jesus being crucified with a lamb at one side and an elephant on the other.
Yeah.
Now, these things are, this is the Druidic story. Now, part of if you don't mind, am I transitioning into this? Because when you talk about
go for it.
So when we talk about the Brehon system sprung from Jeremiah and Tia Tefi. So they arrive in Ireland, and Tia Tefi goes forward. She is of the house of Perez, the last daughter of Zedekiah. She marries Yoked the Herriman. Yoked the Herriman is the first of the kings from the house of Zerach. Remember, Zerach is the primogenitor of Judah. Yoked the Herriman is the first of the kings from the house of Zerach. He marries Tia Tefi. And this brings the 2 houses together, kind of like the red and the white roses of Lancaster and York. Same kind of thing comes here. Yoked the Herriman and Tia Tefi. And from this comes the Tara. And the Tara is going to become the foundation of the common law. And so when you look at this idea of Hugh Godwin teaching the triads and teaching, the music and teaching the idea that it's not to be in writing, it's to be memorized, and the bardic tradition of singing and the Druid tradition of 20 years of study. Well, part of that study was the law. So when we're talking about the law, you're talking about the foundation of the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, were inside the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So the 10 Commandments are the foundation stone of the law. And so the Brehons were required to make whatever decision they had comport with those 10 Commandments. So this would be done in a stone circle. As you mentioned before, that Hugh Godwin would say, okay, it has to be in the open where everyone can see. Well, the stone circles in Wales are really the best stone circles in all of Britain. And, there's a couple that are Midland, that are up north of the Brecon Beacons, that are up there. And I saw some of these, and we went into one that was absolutely perfect. It still had the rocking stone, still had the Logan stone, and it had 12 uncut stones equilaterally dispersed in a circle. Now, one of the things you can tell in that, the instant you walk into one of those stone circles, you can tell what time of the day it is by looking at the shadows. You can even tell what month of the year it is in relation to the equinox or the solstice by where the shadows are pointed. If you get to know those shadows, those circles are a perfect sundial telling you everything you need to know. Then you had the rocking stone, and the Brehon would stand on the rocking stone and he would lean forward on the stone like this when he was talking. And when you were talking, he'd lean back on the stone like this to listen. So back, I'm listening. Go ahead and make your case. Make your case. When it's time for the decision, he leans forward, the stone leans forward. Then because he had given you an objective decision, a judgment, then you would give your offering on a Logan stone. So this was the commonplace system of the Brehons, and the Brehons were unbelievable. They were so well respected. They were respected throughout all of Europe, including in the Celtic world in Central Europe, where the Bretons had gone to teach and to mediate. But remember, the Bretons were never armed. They came with this. They came with the triads. They came with knowledge. And so as part of the understanding, remember that they have the prophecies of the Tanakh. You have all these prophecies. So in these prophecies, it's my belief that the Druids were the Magi, that they didn't come in from India. It's possible they could have, but I believe they came in really from the British Isles because they were absolute experts in astronomy and cosmology. And so when you see a corrected version of the New Testament, they didn't show up 2 years later. Herod was already dead. Herod died immediately after the birth. He died in 3 BC. He died immediately after the birth. They were there the following morning after the birth. They were in Bethlehem talking to Miriam the following morning. And she's like, "What are you doing here? I just had the baby. What are you guys doing here?" "Well, we know you had the baby, and we saw the star, and we saw all this. We knew exactly the location. We knew the prophecies. We knew all of this. So here we are." So when you see Arimathea arriving back in the British Isles with the testimony, these guys who are saying, "Oh yeah, we have this testimony. We have this prophecy of Jesus with an elephant and a lamb on one side and the other," right? That this was, of course, if you will, a prophetic, metaphoric expression that here it comes. Now, in the Gaelic, they call the Mashiach Isa. Isa. In Islamic world, they call the Mashiach Isa.
Isa, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Both those names are inaccurate.
Okay.
But they're going to be used because when Arimathea arrives with the testimony is accepted by the Druids because of this prophecy. They accept this as compared to the testimony in Judea was rejected and he was decapitated. They decapitated the movement. But I find it very interesting that when you look at the record, I think it's the Tacitus record, that they were called Christians, not Christians, but Christians. Okay. Now, Christians is a very interesting term because in the Greek, that means good. As compared to Christians, which means anointed, Christians means good. And the original way they were called was Christians, as Tacitus points out. They were not called Christians. They were called Christians. And this was something that was even adopted by Constantine when he, put out his banner of the key row, the X. When he put out the banner of the key row, he was referred to as a Christian, not a Christian, a good person.
Wow.
And so this was defining goodness. And then, of course, Nero blamed the fire of Rome on the Christians, and literally to prove that he had such disdain for these Christians, not only did he crucify them, but then he doused them in oil and set them on fire to burn as a torch all night.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Horrific.
Yeah. So at any rate, when we look at this joining, now one of the big questions I think we have here is when you look at Monobaz II, he appears to have, even the Talmud talks about him as having certain ideologies that are storing up treasures in heaven, right? Which says, well, that must mean he's the real Jesus. Well, no, not at all. The philosophy of the Mashiach, which had already been taught in that area, was already dominant. And Monobaz, like so many other people in that area, were converts to Judaism. Because Judaism, when it was created around 50 BC, it was created at the point of a sword. It was created at the point of a sword, and it was created at the point of John Hyrcanus' sword, and it was forced circumcision of the Edomites. So when you see Monobaz is ruling in an area that was formerly Idumea. And he was an Edomite, like so many other Edomites. Herod the Great was an Edomite who had been circumcised at the point of a sword, as had his father. So when you see this, he was a convert. He was a convert to Judaism, which at this point had been around for approximately 100 years. And in his conversion, part of that movement inside of Judaism was there hadn't been a robust rejection of Mashiach yet in the Jewish world. If you remember, the first believers for the first 300 years were in Jewish synagogues. That's where the vast majority of the believers were. So it would not surprise me if Monobaz or Monobazus had adopted tenets that were consistent with gospel teaching. And so I think he's downstream from the true narrative of Mashiach. And the narrative of Mashiach is one where, and I think this is where there's so much stuff in the Gospels that, I kind of ask many questions. Like, for instance, there's nothing about Joseph the father after Mashiach is age 12.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then we don't see Mashiach again until he's almost 30 years old. So you have this 18-year period, or where is he, right? Mm-hmm. And I spent time in Cornwall and with my friend Tony, and he took me around to all these places. So we looked at the mythology that is replete in Cornwall about Mashiach being there. Well, one of the things that was very convincing to me was it's called Mara Zion. This is an island that is just out in the bay around Penzance. And this island is very convincing to me in respect of when you see there's so many narratives in the Gospels talking about, Mashiach couldn't talk to the crowd. It was so numerous. He got on a ship. He got on a ship to talk to them. Well, if you know anything about Israel, there wasn't going to be any ship in Kinneret, the Harp Lake, that they call the Sea of Galilee. And I don't think there's going to be a ship off the coast of Yaffo either. You're talking about the ship. I think a lot of those narratives that happened on the ship, including walking on the water and the sea being tumultuous and them almost drowning and him still in the waters and all that, I think that happened off the coast of Britain. That's where I think it. And remember that when we talk about Doggerland being connecting Britain to Europe, this means that there was no Straits of Dover. There was no water between England and France. Right now, between the Straits of Dover, you know how deep they are between England and France? 85 feet deep. 85 feet.
Sorry, you just cut out there, Dr. Pigeon. Can you say that again, please?
Do you know how deep the water is between England and France in the Straits of Dover?
It's very shallow, isn't it?
Yeah, 85 feet.
Yeah.
So this was dry. So when you see that, so what did that area look like north of Brittany? It looked like a circle. Mm-hmm. Circle in the Hebrew is Galil. What was the area called in the northern part of France? Gaul. Galatia. Who were the Galatians that Paul preached to? Did he preach to a group of people in the Anatolian Peninsula, or did he preach to the people in northern France? Were those the Galatians? Was this Gaul? Yeah. Now, you asked the question, were Peter and Paul in Britain? Well, I can tell you that, this book by Graham Phillips talking about the grave of Mary that he discovered in the Vatican. Why did Rome feel compelled to repatriate the bones of Mary to Britain? And the narrative is that not only did Rome repatriate the bones of Mary to Britain, but also Peter and Paul, whose bones were repatriated to the Abbey of Augustine in Canterbury. Now, since then, Augustine and the bones of Peter and Paul have been moved to some discrete location. I don't know where it is. But at one time, they were supposedly buried in the Abbey.
Wow.
And so
Canterbury Cathedral.
Yeah, well, the cathedral, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the cathedral sits here in Canterbury. If you go over, it's just a couple of blocks over. There is maybe a 5 hectare parcel that is the Abbey of Augustine. There's a museum there, and you can walk the whole abbey. You can see the footprint of the original church, which is about the size of St. Peter's, and
Wow.
you can also see that the footprint of the monastery that was there, and so it's all there.
Wow. Brilliant. Okay. By the way, I just remembered in a previous episode you were talking about in Cornwall there are these stones of what looks like a boy crucified on a cross, and I've looked them up, and there's quite a few, which is very, very intriguing. Okay, I'm just going through my questions now, Dr. Pigeon, because we've kind of answered one or two of them. I will ask you this: was St. Peter ever in Britain? Many of the old churches in Wales that we've discussed already are named after him, including the one that Wilson of Blackett had excavated some 35 years ago. So, do you think that Peter was ever in Britain?
I think he was. Now, I don't have any evidence of this in any kind of recording anywhere, other than the fact that there has been information that his bones were originally buried in Britain, that his bones were originally buried in Britain. And then the Romans picked them all up and they moved them all to the Vatican. And this is why you see this idea of the tomb in the Vatican and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The Vatican itself has a horrendous history. The St. Peter's Square was built as a sundial using an Egyptian obelisk that was put there by Caligula. And Caligula was responsible for the martyrdom of over 130,000 Christians in that very place. And their bones are underneath the Vatican.
Wow.
To this day.
Yeah.
So the claim that, and of course, the Vatican has this big stake in saying the first pope was Peter, but the record shows that the first pope was, in fact, Lucius, the grandson of Caradoc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that Paul was the one that anointed him, not Peter. So unless you accept the Gnostic work from the 4th century that Peter was in Rome, there's no other evidence that Peter was in Rome. However, would Peter have would he have traveled into the British Isles? And again, there is plenty of evidence that this would be the case because Arimathea had established vast shipping lines. He controlled over 70 ships. And these 70 ships were bringing tin and copper and everything else into the Middle East out of the British Isles. And so there was all this ship traffic ongoing all the time. Mary Magdalene and Lazarus, are known to have landed in Marseille, and their mission would be from Marseille up the Rhone River, all the way up to Lyon and back. Mm-hmm. There are people who believe they have the skull of Mary Magdalene. I mean, they worship it down there in Marseille, right? And so Mary Magdalene and when you look at this idea, one of my friends, Shane Stokes in Cardiff, he's a big disciple of Alan Wilson, a very good friend of Ross. He was the one that introduced me to Ross Broadstock. And Shane and I have talked about this a great deal. And Shane says, look, it's a family affair. When you look at what's called the Dispacini, which were the family around Mashiach, it's a family affair. So, and you cannot imagine. I mean, like, for instance, when you look at the wedding in Capernaum where the water is turned to wine, who got married there? We don't know.
No.
The gospel silent. But it's very possible that was the wedding of Mary Magdalene and Lazarus.
I've previously heard actually it was the marriage of Mary Magdalene and Jesus.
Now, Jesus was not married to Mary Magdalene. I mean, I know there's people who want to say that. Dan Brown is one who wants to say that.
Well, I've heard. Sorry, Dr. Pigeon, but I've heard that some people say that because Jesus was a rabbi, he would have been married.
Well, that's according to the Talmud. Now, do you think he was a respecter of the Talmud when he's telling the Pharisees, "You den of vipers"? No.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And and he was gone for 18 years before his ministry starts. And I believe those 18 years were spent in Cornwall. That's where
Hmm.
he was. He was in Cornwall for those 18 years. And what was he doing? He was learning and understanding, or not learning, but I'm not going to say he was learning, but his understanding was replete with what you would see in a bard or an archdruid. That is to say, he understood the Torah, the prophecies, he understood astronomy, he understood botany, he understood music, he understood geometry, he understood all these things. So when he gets back to, Idumea, he's like, you guys, I see you guys trying to recreate this, but you guys are off. You don't, this is wrong. That's wrong. You don't understand this. You're getting this wrong. What are you talking about? And so they rejected him, and they wanted to kill him because he told them the truth. Right?
Mm.
That's why they wanted
Hmm.
to kill him. It's like
Yeah.
what's his name said, the Irish author said, if you're going to tell people the truth, make sure you make them smile. Otherwise, they'll turn and kill you.
Yeah, I've heard that one. It's very
Yeah,
true. Yeah,
Oscar Wilde. Yeah, and so
that's it.
this is what this is what happened. But for him to come in, so they asked him, "How is it that you know these scriptures like this? How are you able to quote like how? Where did you get this information? Aren't you the carpenter's son? Where'd you have that? Where'd this come from that you're able to talk about all these things, right?"
Mm.
And like I say, and Marazion, the island of Marazion off the coast of Penzance, is very, very convincing. And so these things, I think, are so when you talk about Peter being able to get there, when you see Arimathea, he says, okay, look, I've had it here in Idumea. He was living there with his wife. And after Mashiach had been crucified, they were proclaiming the name. And in proclaiming the name, well, the Sanhedrin started beating him. And he got beaten every year for 5 years. He was
Mm.
a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a member of the Roman Senate. And they're beating this guy. And finally, he says in 36 AD, he said, that's it. I'm done. We're out of here. They put him on the ship and everybody leaves.
Mm.
Well, it wasn't just him. Now, Peter had a failed, believe it was a failed church in Antioch because he tried to create a communist church in Antioch and it failed
Okay. Yeah.
because the people fell dead, and when
Mhm.
they fell dead, everybody else was terrified. So he left and he went down to Alexandria. Well, he went down to what is now Cairo. It's called
Mhm.
Fortress Babylon in Second Peter. He went down there with John Mark. The Gospel of Mark is written in Fortress Babylon. It's going to be the foundation of the faith in Alexandria. But then what did he do? Remember that Jeremiah had shipped that same passage, right? Through the Straits of Gibraltar into Ireland. And Arimathea has got 70 ships doing passage all the time. So now you see Mary Magdalene and Eleazar, they're in the south of France. Arimathea is in Britain. What's going to prevent you from going into Britain? What would stop you? Nothing would. The door is open. And even Paul, like, when you see Arimathea coming into Britain in 36 AD, Paul's ministry doesn't begin until 48 AD. That's in the book of Galatians, chapter
Mhm.
2. Tells you he was 3 years after the crucifixion hanging out with the disciples. Then he was gone for 14 years. So his ministry didn't start until 48 AD.
Mhm.
And it ended around 67 or 68 AD.
Mhm.
So in that period of time, could Peter have come into Britain? I think the answer is possibly yes.
Yeah,
Where
very
did he
cool.
go? Where did he preach? I mean, did he show up in Cardiff instead of coming in through Mousehole or coming in through Plymouth to talk at Mount Lude? Did he in fact come in instead into Caerdeed, into that area, coming up the Sevens estuary? The whole business, I just want to say this, the whole business about Glastonbury, I'm not a big fan of the Glastonbury mythology at all.
Yeah.
I think Somerset was swamp. I don't think there was an abbey there until at least 1000 AD. There was nothing on the Tor there until 900 AD. So, that whole stuff I think is mythology. There's a place in Cornwall called Tintagel. And I think,
Integral, yeah.
yeah, even that is a bit mythological. It's possible that castle that's built on that side of the wall could have been Camelot because it's certainly well protected, you know,
Mm.
by the natural forces.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about I kind of draw the line at Templar mythology. I think the Templars made up a whole bunch of stuff and started rewriting history in their own image, around the 9th and 10th century.
Okay.
But the record, when you get down to the Ding Dong Mine and you get down to Marazion, you begin to see, and when you study the old mythological folk songs that they sing in Cornwall, you know,
Yeah.
and even the group America used to sing a homage to the Tin Man.
Yeah.
You know, never said
Yeah.
nothing to the Tin Man. Well, who's the Tin Man? It's Arimathea.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So we have the Cornish legends of Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain, possibly with Jesus as a boy. And we have certain place names as well in the area that allude to that story. But is there a reliable historic source for that information that Joseph of Arimathea was a tin merchant and that he came to Britain? Can we get that from history at all?
Yeah, that history is Roman history, talking about nobilis decuriae. And so when you look at and this is some of it's found in Tacitus. And when you look at the history of nobilis decuriae, you'll see that this is a reference to Arimathea and his trade and the trade that was going
Okay.
on.
Thank
Now
you for
there's
that.
an additional record too, which is that it's very clear that the tin that was coming out of Cornwall was used in the Middle East in the creation of bronze because they can identify the alloy. So they know that the tin was coming out of there.
Wow.
And
Brilliant.
so when you talk about being able to have an authoritative source, I mean, you go back to Gildas, what do you have? You can only go back so far, and then there's no record.
Yeah.
But what we do have is we have circumstantial evidence that, like for instance, there is no other place on earth that claims that the Messiah was there as a child. There's two places on earth that claims he was there after his death. One is in like Nepal, and the
Yeah.
other is Japan. And both of those
Mm.
myths were brought to those places by Muslims who believed that he faked his death on the cross, that it was his brother died on the cross, and that he, escaped with his wife and family out to India or out to Japan. And this is the narrative thinking. When I hear that narrative, I hear the Muslim story. That's what I hear. This is what
Okay.
this is Islamic teaching. Isa, the only place on earth that claims he was there as a child is Cornwall. It's the only place on earth that this myth even exists. That
Yeah.
there's nobody else talking about it. And
Mm.
then the myth is accompanied by ancient songs, ancient sayings, and the kind of phrasing that is used by the tin miners that have been used there for 1,500 years, 1,000 years. They've been
Mm.
saying these same things to one another, you know,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
singing Arimathea. So, but like I say, Mara Zion, I thought is very. The narrative is that they were trapped on Mara Zion for 3 months because the tide was too high, because they anticipated. Mara Zion has that walkway that goes to the
Yeah.
beach,
Yeah.
and it's now brick. But I mean, that let me tell you, that walkway is treacherous. You're going to walk that walkway. You better make sure that you catch it right at
Yeah.
moment.
You have to get the timing right, don't you? Otherwise, you're in trouble.
Yeah, because that tide comes in a hurry,
Yeah.
a hurry, and and very quickly you don't have anything to walk on. But the fact that they were trapped there for 3 months, I believe that. Now, there's another bit of evidence too, which is that this ley line that exists from these monasteries of Saint Michael.
Hmm.
So there's one in the far western coast of Ireland that's an ancient relic. Then it ties in a direct ley line to this monastery of St. Michael on Mare Zion, which ties directly in a straight line to Mont Saint
April.
Michel in
Yeah.
France,
Right.
which ties to another monastery in northern Italy on the Italian Swiss border, which ties again to another monastery in central Italy, all named after Michael. But it does not tie in a straight line into the Holy Land. Rather, it ties to two other monasteries named Michael. One is in Alexandria in Egypt, and the other is in Ethiopia.
Ah, okay. That's very
We just,
interesting.
we just found that recently. But there's
Yeah.
7 of them in this exact ley line. So
Yeah.
again, this is kind of, again, this is circumstantial evidence, right? Is it dispositive? Can you say this is enough to make a case?
Yeah.
No. But there is evidence that something was there in place of nothing else anywhere else.
Mm.
Now, a lot of historians have kind of taken this position. Like, for instance, Graham Hancock takes this position. Well, you can call it mythology if you want, When you look, for instance, at the Hindu record, the Hindu mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and Hebrew mythology concerning giants, and they all tell the same narrative, well, he isn't a myth.
Yeah, there was a British Prime Minister in the 19th century called Benjamin Disraeli, and he said a tradition can neither be made nor destroyed.
Yeah, there you go. Can neither be made nor destroyed. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so this is something that when we see this, that okay, so I found the evidence, and of course the evidence of Miriam being in Anglesey, I think is pretty good evidence. I think it's pretty good evidence there. And again, it's like like for instance, you walk into a graveyard, okay, go into a Welsh graveyard, and you look at the stones that are older than 1700, and the rain has washed the inscription completely off the stone.
Mm-hmm.
Carved on the stone at one point. Now you look at a stone and it's blank. It's just a blank slate, right? Well, imagine going back now to the year 1000. Imagine going back to the year 0. Imagine going back another 500 years before that. What do you expect to find? What has the weather done? What has the climate done? What is everything? What has the geography done? What has everything done? So in terms of trying to piece together the record, and this is why, like, for instance, the fellow that identified the Colburn language, he to this day is called the forger. Oh, you made it up. You made it up. And then Alan Wilson comes up with, 100 stones that have the Colburn on it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And his son, who, what his son's name was? His son's name was Taliesin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He named his son, right?
Yolo Morganwood, yeah. Morganwood.
Yeah. And here they go. And they have, and so the Colburn is really huge in determining the history. So when Alan Wilson, he was brought into the States and he showed up in Kentucky at the University of Kentucky, and they had this thing called the Bat Cave stone. And they pulled out this stone and they said, "What do you think about this?" He said, "Everybody thinks this is Paleo Hebrew." And Alan Wilson looked at it and said, "No, that's Colburn." And then when they went into the burial mounds in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, they found these relics of holding the 10 Commandments and so on inside these burial mounds. First of all, they're burial mounds. Secondly, they've got these stone inscription in Colburn. So, of course, the conclusion was started to come to Wilson that Prince Madoc had in fact come down the St. Lawrence waterway, did in fact discover, North America around 580 AD, came back to Britain. There was a huge catastrophic event, and Arthur himself went into North America and was killed in North America by the native tribes.
Okay, this is very interesting because many people have that Arthur, I think, being mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan in Wales. But I have heard this rumor about Arthur going to America. So you think there's some validity to that, yeah?
Well, I mean, there's the picture of Arthur II on a wall there in a church in Wales. It's Llandaff Major. I think it's in Llandaff Major on the wall of him having 12 arrows in him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe that's how he was mortally wounded at that battle, but it's also possible. I mean, look, when you look at the native tribes in America, there is a tribe that has red hair and blue eyes. Okay, so where they come from, right?
Yeah.
And and so I think there was a substantial Welsh presence in America, and I think some of those tribes are still they're Caucasian, for lack of a better word, Caucasian tribes that are still occupying some of the areas. They're around the Canadian border now.
Wow. Okay, brilliant. Dr. Pigeon, this has been absolutely fantastic. I say this every time I see you, but it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for all the information you shared with me today. So many different avenues to go down now with my research into this. Fantastic. Can I just ask you one last question before we finish today, please? We'll end on a big one. So what are the best documents that prove the existence of Jesus Christ? What are your thoughts on the Testimonium Flavinum and the Tacitus letter that relates to Jesus? Are they genuine or forgeries? I've always personally thought that the Testimonium Flavinum was an interpolation, possibly added by Eusebius hundreds of years later, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you with the Testimonium Flavium. I think that was probably an interpolation, and there have been there's quite a bit of interpolation in the scripture. We see it all the time, and I call it Roman overwrite.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Roman overwrite, and Eusebius was responsible for a lot of that. And Eusebius was also responsible for a lot of omission. The Tacitus reference, however, I think is accurate.
Mm.
Now, there are some other things too. There's a thing
Mm-hmm.
out there called the Archco volume, and which supposedly contains Pilate's letter to the Roman Senate. Now, some people have said that's a
Yes.
forgery, but nonetheless, it tends to comport with what's called the Gospel of Nicodemus. Now, the Gospel of Nicodemus is another text that I think goes along with Acts chapter 29, which is the Sonini manuscript, which also goes along with some of the testimony in the Gospels that indicate. So, when you look at some of this proof, number one, did Pontius Pilate commit suicide jumping down the face of a mountain in Switzerland? That's one question. And the answer is, yeah, he did. The Swiss readily, the people who live at the base of that mountain say, yeah, that's true. This is where he did it, right here at this mountain. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's well known. So this is documented in Acts chapter 29, the Sonini manuscript. Okay, so if Pilate committed suicide, that gives us some information. The information that's contained in the Gospel of Nicodemus is a much more detailed account about what happens during the time of the crucifixion. And in particular, the kind of arguments that's being made by Pilate with the Sanhedrin about whether or not they could crucify him and what was actually going on at the cross. Now, when you talk about some of the artifacts, most of the artifacts are false. They were created by Helen, the wife of Constantine. The geography may even be false. But when you talk about the truth of the proposition of Mashiach, the truth of the proposition of Mashiach is the proof is in the pudding, as they say in Britain, right? And when you look at the narrative, when like at the Sefer, we have carefully reconstructed the transliteration of all these names into the English language. So we know that the Mashiach's name was Yahusha. He was named after Joshua, whose original name was Usha, and then Moses named him Yahusha after he'd successfully spied out the land. Well, Yahusha has a particular name. It contains the name of the Father, which is Yahweh. The name of Yahweh is contained wholly in the name Yahusha. And Yahusha means Yahweh saves. So when you look at Isaiah 45 tells you, there is none other. I am your Savior. I am the only one. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess and swear 7 oaths that I am the one. Yahweh says this. Paul quotes this in Romans chapter 10, quotes that very saying. But then in Philippians chapter 2, he says that the Messiah was given the name above all names. Well, the name above all names is Yahweh, and that name was given to him, Yahusha.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that name means Yahweh saves. So the question is that proposition true? The answer is yes. Okay, now the next proposition is, was he crucified and did these events occur? Well, again, as Disraeli said, you can't create a tradition and you can't stop one.
Mm-hmm.
And this tradition has a fabric to it that was unstoppable, absolutely unstoppable. When we're talking about burning 130,000 people at the stake, like Nero and Caligula did, you would think that would stop it.
Mm.
It did not stop it. It continued to grow. So when you're talking about hard evidence, of the Messiah, we know this is that here's the difficulty. When you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, Robert Eisenman has said the Dead Sea Scrolls were probably created by James the Just,
Mm-hmm.
who was the brother or half brother of the Mashiach.
Yeah.
Okay, so James the Just, called Yaakov Sadiq, was running Qumran, the ancient name Damask, which, by the way, it's a ruinous heap. He was running a monastery, a monastic order at Qumran. They wrote the community rules, and they probably wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the New Testament?
Mm.
where is the New Testament? All
Yeah.
right. Now, probably the most confirmed writing of all of it is a thing called the Ascents of James or the Ascents of Yaakov. And this was contained in the Clementine homilies. And there have been, I don't know, 15 historians who have looked at this work and have concluded that this is the most authenticated work of the period, the Ascents of James. And this is the testimony of the disciples in the public square after the death of Mashiach, defending the faith in front of the Sanhedrin. If you ever read this, Ascents of James, and it
Mhm.
also assigns a pretty nasty habit to Paul, who was causing a riot at the time, trying to get angry
Mm.
with. Yeah, but this is probably the most authoritative work of the period. Then when you start talking about Eusebius, I mean, for instance, there is the Ethiopian Bible,
Yeah.
and the Gemara Gospels preceded Eusebius by almost 200 years. And
Okay.
these Gospels have a very similar narrative. Now, when of course the Ge'ez text is difficult because who speaks Ge'ez, right?
Yeah.
And so we've had to rely on some very astute scholars to translate the Ge'ez. And even now, the Ethiopian Bible is a difficult text to get your hands on, but it is a pre-Eusebius text. Now, also the Aramaic claim in the Peshitta is a claim that is the people who are behind the Peshitta. They say, well, the Aramaic text existed in the 2nd century, and therefore it also preceded Eusebius. Well, you can't prove it because the earliest artifact is from the 5th century in Aramaic.
Okay.
And so the Aramaic Peshitta, most of them are absolutely beautiful books, by the way, if you ever read a Peshitta. They're exquisite, really. But
Yeah.
they're generous. Okay. I'm going to leave it that way. They're generous. They have generous translation effects to them. So really the narrative is such that, and here's another problem too. When you talk about Mashiach coming out of the Brehon tradition, coming out of the Druidic tradition, why
Mhm.
did he pick? First of all, why did he show up at a time? Why didn't he show up now when there's internet? Right? He can broadcast his message everywhere. It can be digitized. There can be transcripts, on and on and on and on.
Mhm.
Instead, it's a period of time. There's no printing press, right? There's only scribes writing on parchment, and most of his Talmudim, his disciples, were illiterate. They couldn't read or write.
Mm. Yeah.
Peter couldn't read or write. He had to have Mark do it. You know, and so you had an illiterate group of people. Why did he do that? Because he was using a Druidic tradition. Why is there no Hebrew manuscript of the initial Gospels? Because it was transmitted using the Brehon pattern of triadic expression and bringing the narrative forward by memory. Okay, and so this is why one of the first fragments you find is of the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is not this Druidic expression, but the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke is going to come in, and Lucius now. This is the first Pope of Rome, appointed by Paul, the son of Caradoc, brilliant guy. He spoke whatever language was being spoken in Britain. He also spoke Latin. He also spoke Greek. Very fluent, very articulate, brilliant guy. And he's going to write the Gospel of Luke. But we know the Gospel of Luke is a hearsay manuscript, right? It's a
Mhm.
hearsay manuscript. This is what they told me happened. And I'm going to set it
Right.
for chronological order, right?
Yep.
Eusebius didn't do the world, I mean, of course he put together the text, but Eusebius engaged in omissions. We know this, the Gospel according to the Hebrews. He left out at least 22 verses or verse fragments. He left them out. He has them in his own notebook, but I'm not going to put those in. He didn't put them in, right?
Mhm.
And so he admitted that he made mistakes. He created the name Lucifer. He put horns on Moses. He did some other things that were like, hey, well, okay, Eusebius, you're a little bit drifty here, right? But yeah, so we have to look to other sources. Now, there's stuff that's going on right now that people are extolling the virtues of the Gimmer Gospels, saying these are really the best texts. Well, maybe they are. But again, when you're talking about hard evidence from the period, mm, no, it's going to, and and
Mm.
again, you know, this is why it really is a question of faith. It's a question of
Yeah,
faith
yeah.
because Shiach gave it to us in a verbal record and said, "You are to understand this by singing triads to one another, by telling these parables, by understanding these things in this manner." Because again, the Druidic thinking is once you write it, you kill it.
Mm.
Like I'll give you an example. If you have a 10-year-old son, write down the description of your 10-year-old son. 2 years from now, how accurate is it? Well, he was 5'2". He did weigh 120 pounds, and he was getting pretty good at fractions. And now 4 years later, he's finished algebra 1. He's 6'1". He's 200 pounds. Is it the same guy, right?
Yeah,
So when you
brilliant.
fix something in writing, you fix it. That's the end of the narrative. That's why the Druids didn't do it. That's why it was
Mm.
important to teach it verbally and to sing it. And
Mm.
and this is one of the great difficulties in theology today. Most people's theology is based upon worship songs that they memorize and what their Sunday school teacher taught them.
Mm. Wow, incredible stuff. Brilliant. Okay. You've made so much sense of the history I've been covering over the last few months. You've kind of stitched it all together. It's just incredible. So I'll be watching this back probably about 1,000 times, and I'll be in touch again in the near future to try and persuade you to come back on. We're going to be covering the kings of Glamorgan and Gwent, so King Arthur 1, King Arthur 2, taking a deep dive into the Brutus migrations and all sorts of other things. So I hope to be able to speak to you again, Dr. Pigeon. It's been amazing. It's been brilliant.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you,
so
Paul. Thank you
much.
for having me. I love your show. By the way, I love your opening. Your, the
Yeah,
your show. It just sings to my soul, man. It just really
me
does.
too. Me too. And it's a lot to live up to. But you certainly have helped me do that today. So thank you so much, Dr. Pigeon. I'll be in touch very soon. Thank you for watching, everyone. I'm sure that you just enjoyed that. Please like and share and subscribe. Next week, I've got on Hugh Evans. We'll be taking a very close look at a stone circle in Wales called Bryn Caderfanna, which I visited last year in Gwynedd. It's an amazing site. So please join us next Sunday. Thank you very much, Dr. Pigeon. And thanks everyone for watching. Cheers.